On my 18th birthday, my parents told me they spent 95% of my trust fund on my sister's weddings. Hope you understand, they said. So, I sued them and destroyed everything they built. I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the kind of thing you'd see on one of those reality shows or read about in a gossip magazine. But for me, this wasn't a TV plot or some over-the-top drama. This was my real life, my future, my trust. And they took it all, every last bit, without even a second thought. Let me start from the beginning so you understand just how calculated and cold it was. My name is Stanley, and I'm 18 years old. I have two older sisters, Victoria, who's 26, and Ashley, who's 24. If you know anything about people like my sisters, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They're high maintenance with a capital H. Designer bags, expensive brunches, and this whole Instagram influencer vibe that never quite hit the mark. They work part-time jobs in boutiques, living one who would foot the bill, but it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. And my parent? Well, let's just say they weren't doing any better. Upper, middle-class wannabes, trying so hard to keep up with the neighbors that they were drowning in debt. Dad worked as a regional sales manager, pulling in around $120,000 a year. Mom worked part-time in real estate, barely clearing $40,000. Still, they managed to live in a neighborhood where everyone drove leased luxury cars and threw lavish parties to make it look like they had it all. But when it came to me, I wasn't the priority. Growing up, it was always clear that my sisters were the ones who needed the attention. Every major event, every birthday, every graduation was an production. Victoria's high school graduation, an extravagant party that cost more than most people's weddings. Her college graduation, even bigger. She was the dramatic one, and everything had to be Ashley. She was sneakier. She had this way of playing the victim, manipulating people with just the right amount of tears and guilt trips to get what she wanted. Me, I was the quiet one. The one who didn't demand attention. The one who learned to keep my head down and do the right thing without expecting a parade afterward. By the time I was 17, I had about $12,000 saved up from part-time jobs, mowing lawns, busting tables, and eventually working at auto parts store. It wasn't much compared to the money my sister spent on their lifestyle, but it was mine. I had a plan. I was going to use it for college. I'd even researched schools, looked at scholarships, and checked out trade programs, just in case. My grades weren't stellar, but they were good enough for state schools, and with a little extra help from the trust fund, I figured I'd be all set. Here's the thing about that trust fund, though it was set up by my grandfather. When I was born, he made sure each of his grandkids had a trust to help pay for college. I always knew it was there. I just didn't know how much. But as I grew older, I overheard my parents talking about how much money had been set aside for me. And by the time I turned 18, I was doing the math in my head. If the trust was set up back in the late 90s and had been growing for 18 years, it had to be a decent chunk of money. I figured I'd get least money $80,000. Enough to cover tuition and living expenses with some left over. That was the plan. But when I turned 18, that plan went up in smoke. I thought we'd sit down, have a nice dinner, and then they'd tell me exactly how much was in the trust fund so I could finalize my college plans. Instead, I got a conversation that changed everything. My birthday dinner was nothing extravagant. Mom made my favorite lasagna, and I figured we'd talk about the trust fund afterward. But when I pulled out my laptop to start going over college options, everything shifted. My dad cleared his throat, and my mom suddenly became very interested in her water glass. That's when I knew something was wrong. About that, Dad said slowly, "You need to talk about your expectations regarding Grandpa's trust fund." Expectation. Not plans, expectations. I didn't know how to respond. Okay, what about it? My mom jumped in, her voice way too cheerful. "Well, sweetie, you know your sisters both got married recently. Beautiful weddings. Victoria's was at that gorgeous vineyard, and Ashley's was at the country club. Those were really important milestones for the family." I stared at her. "Does that have to do with my trust fund?" Dad cleared his throat again. "Those weddings were expensive, very expensive. And as parents, we wanted to give your sisters the best possible start to their marriages. Family is about each other during important life events." I could feel the coldness creep up my spine. How expensive? Victoria's wedding cost about $85,000. Mom said, like she was discussing grocery bills. Ashley's was around $78,000. Plus, we helped them both with down payments on their condos. That was another $40,000 combined. My heart stopped. I did the math instantly. You spent my trust fund on their weddings. Dad looked at me with that corporate smile of his, trying to appear calm. We made some difficult decisions, he said. The trust funds were available resources, and we determined the best use of those resources was supporting your sisters during these important life events. They'd even look guilty. They didn't even try to hide it. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with an unfortunate financial decision. This was a betrayal, a complete, calculated theft. Growing up was never about me. My sisters Victoria and Ashley were the stars of the show. They didn't just get attention, they demanded it, like they were born for the spotlight. They had the looks, the charm, and the knack for making everything about them. If it wasn't their birthday, it was their graduation, their wedding, or their latest social media post. Whatever it was, it had to be a spectacle. Victoria was the loud one. She never did anything halfway, and every milestone in her life felt like a production. Her high school graduation party wasn't just a small gathering, celebration, complete with rented limos and a live band. My parents treated it like she just won an Olympic gold medal. When she got her real estate license, after failing the exam twice, you'd think she's just CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Mom and Dad threw a party, complete with expensive champagne, as if she'd just passed the bar exam. Ashley, on the other hand, was more subtle. She didn't demand attention the way Victoria did. Instead, she'd use her tears and manipulation to get what she wanted. A well-timed cry, a little hint of victimhood, and suddenly, everything in the house shifted to accommodate her. She had this way of making you feel guilty if you didn't give in. If she needed money, she'd find the right moment, the right look, and bam, she had it. I never did things that way. I didn't make a fuss. I didn't ask a fuss. In fact, I learned early on that the best way to stay out of the drama was to keep my head down, do my work, and not expect a thing. I focused on school, grades, and worked part-time jobs starting at 15. I mowed lawns, waited tables at a diner, and finally landed a job at an auto parts store. By the time I was 17, I'd saved up around $12,000. It wasn't much compared to the things my sisters spent, but it was mine. I was going to use it for college. I had plans. Detailed plans. I researched scholarships, looked into state schools, and even explored trade programs. Even if I didn't go to a 4-year college, I could still make a living. I worked hard to save, watched my sisters blow money like it was nothing, and I planned for my future. But the trust fund was always there in the background. Grandpa had set it up when I was born. It was supposed to cover my education, plain and simple. When Grandpa passed away, my parents became the trustees, managing the money until I turned 18. I knew it was there, but I never asked for the specifics. I overheard bits and pieces of conversations over the years, and I figured the amount would be decent. Maybe $180,000. That's enough to cover tuition and living expenses for college. I didn't realize how wrong I was until my 18th birthday. I'd spent months planning for this moment. I figured this would be the time to get the details on the trust fund, sit down with my parents, figure out how much was in it, and finalize my college plans. But instead of a calm, responsible conversation, I got hit with something I never expected. My parents sat me down after dinner. I thought we'd talk about my plans for school. Instead, they told me about how they'd spent nearly all of my trust sisters' weddings. They didn't just take a little, they took nearly everything. We spent 95% of your trust fund on your sisters' weddings, my mom said, her voice almost casual. Hope you understand. My stomach dropped, I could barely process the words. My mind immediately went to the numbers, to the math I'd done in my head over the years. That trust fund was supposed to set me up. It was meant to fund my future, my education, my career, the life I'd planned. Wait a minute, I said slowly, trying to wrap my head around it. You spent it. On their weddings. Victoria's wedding had cost $85,000. Ashley's had been $78,000. And that wasn't all. My parents had also given them both money for down payments on their condos. $40,000. The reality hit me like a punch in the gut. I didn't know how to respond. I felt numb. Betrayed. How could they do this? How could they take my future and throw it away for a couple of overpriced ceremonies? Nothing less. We made some tough decisions, my dad said, but lacking any real remorse. The trust funds were there, and we felt it was best to support your sisters during these important milestones. Support them? I asked, my voice cold, seeing from my future. Dad didn't have a real answer. He just kept going on about family and supporting each other. But I wasn't hearing it. This wasn't about family. It was about their need to maintain a fa, to keep up with the image of success they couldn't afford. They'd put everything into appearances, and I was the one left holding the bag. I looked at my mom, trying to find some trace of guilt. But there was nothing. Nothing. How much is left? I asked, my voice sounding distant. Detached? Dad pulled out a folder. Inside was a statement showing the balance of my trust fund. $8,472. Out of what should have been $180,000. They'd burned through 95% of it. All for their daughters' weddings. I closed my laptop slowly. I had no more words for them. I stood up and walked to my room, closing the door behind me. My mind raced. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg them to fix it. No, this was a problem that required a solution. I had a plan. And I was going to make them pay for what they had done. Not for the money. Not for the wedding expenses. But for stealing my future. I knew I couldn't just sit around and let this go. They'd stolen my future, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I wasn't going to cry or yell at them. That would be too easy. No, I needed something more. A way to make them pay, without getting caught up in the emotions of it all. So I started planning. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. This wasn't just about a few weddings, it was about the principle. About what they did to me. I sat that night in my room, researching. It felt like a shift had happened in me, no more the passive son, no longer the one who had to suck it up for the sake of family. I was going to take this the next level. I fired up my laptop, opened Google, and started reading about trust law. What were my rights? What had they done wrong? I learned that when someone sets up a trust, the person managing it has a duty to use the money for the purpose intended. If the trust was for education, the funds couldn't be spent on anything else, not weddings, not vacations, not condos. I spent hours reading. I found articles on fiduciary duties, breach of trust, and how to take legal action if a trustee violated the terms of a trust. Everything I read had broken the law. They had misused the money, and I could do something about it. The next day, I took it a step further. I needed evidence. I couldn't just go to a lawyer and say, they took my trust fund for their weddings. I had to show them exactly what happened. I knew my dad was meticulous about paperwork. He was one of those guys who kept everything in order, color-coded files, neatly stacked papers, even his tax returns from 10 years ago. It was like a version saying on top of things. Well, that was about to be his biggest mistake. When they went to church on Sunday, I knew I had a few hours. I waited for them to leave, then slipped into my dad's home office. It wasn't like I'd never done it before, but this time felt different. This time, I was looking for something specific. The filing cabinets were just as I remembered, neat, organized. I opened one and started pulling out folders, skimming through documents. Most of it was boring stuff, old bills, insurance papers, tax filings. But then I found it. A folder labeled Estate Robert Sr. That was my grandpa, the one who'd set up the trust in the first place. My heart started racing as I flipped through the papers inside. There it was. The original trust document. The one that clearly stated the money was for my tuition, books, living expenses, and nothing else. I took pictures of every page with my phone, making sure I had everything in case I needed it later. Next, I pulled out the bank statements. I knew my parents' access to the account, and what I found confirmed my worst fears. Starting 3 years ago, there were massive withdrawals, exactly when Victoria's wedding was being planned. And then more withdrawals 2 years ago, right around the time Ashley's wedding was happening. I cross-referenced the dates, the amounts, and the transactions with their wedding timelines. There was no question about it. They'd used my trust fund for their weddings. I was shaking as I looked at the documents, but I didn't let it stop me. I took pictures of everything, the withdrawals, the dates, the amounts. The more I dug, the more I realized how deep this went. This wasn't a missight. This was oversight. This was a deliberate plan to steal from me. When I had everything I needed, I sat back and just stared at the pile of evidence. I'd been betrayed in a way I couldn't even fully comprehend. But one thing they had stolen from me, and now I was going to make them pay for it. I had the documents, the timeline, the proof. All I needed now was to take the next step, find a lawyer who would help me make them face the consequences. I wasn't to just let this go. Not anymore. That night, I reached out to a few law firms that specialized in trust litigation. I didn't know much about the legal system, but I was about to learn. I was going to make sure my parents and sisters learned something, too. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at them just because I was angry. This was about justice. About making sure they understood that stealing from me had consequences. They'd used my future to fund their selfish fantasies, and now they were going to lose everything they had because of it. And I was going to be the one to make sure that happened. I knew I had to act quickly, so the next day, I called every law firm I could find that specialized in trust litigation. The phone calls were awkward at first. What was I supposed to say? Hey, my parents took almost all of my trust fund and spent it on their weddings. Can you help me sue them? But I was determined. I needed someone to guide me through this. The first lawyer I met with was Patterson. He was older, in his 50s, sharp suit, and seemed like the kind of guy who knew his stuff. I laid everything out for him, my research, the documents I had gathered. I even showed him the timeline of withdrawals from the trust account and how they corresponded with my sister's weddings. Patterson didn't blink. He just kept nodding, flipping through the papers, then leaned back in his chair. This is actionable, he said after a while. I stared at him. Actionable? What do you mean by that? He smiled, almost like he was relieved to hear me ask, your case. Your parents breached their fiduciary duty as trustees. This is textbook breach of trust. They've misused your money. They spent it on things that weren't covered by the trust. I could feel a small wave of relief. It wasn't just my anger talking. It wasn't just about getting back at my parents. I had a legal standing. I wasn't in the wrong here. What can I get out of this? I asked. He pulled out a calculator and started doing the math. Let's see, the original deposit was $50,000 back in 1998. Given moderate returns, we're looking at around $142,000 today, maybe a little more depending on investments. I sat up straighter. You're left with about $8,400, right? Patterson continued. That's what your parents have left in the account. So that's about $134,000 you're owed, plus damages. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. $134,000. That was the money I was supposed to have. The money that would set me up for a future. And now it was gone, spent on wedding flowers, photograph venues. What about my sisters? I asked. They were complicit, Patterson said. If they knew the money came from your trust fund, and if they knew it was meant for your education, they could be held liable too. That hit me like a punch to the gut. Victoria and Ashley, the ones who spent it all without a second thought. I want them included, I said, without hesitation. They knew. They have to pay too. Patterson raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Going after your sisters is going to complicate things. It's going to get ugly. I'm sure, I replied, my voice steady. This isn't just about money. This is about making them face what they did. If they knew, they should pay. Patterson seemed to respect that. All right, we'll go after them too. But you have to understand, this is going to be a long road. Lawsuits like this, especially with family involved, are messy. But if we win, you could make. Plus damages. I felt a strange calmness wash over me. The anger was still there, but now it had a purpose. I wasn't just angry at my parents anymore. I was angry at the system that let them steal from me. I was angry at the way they justified it all, treating my future like it was expendable for the sake of appearances. Over the next few days, Patterson and I went over the strategy. He explained everything to me in detail, how the lawsuit would unfold, what I could expect during the discovery phase, and how the trial would work if it came to that. The first step was simply, we needed to file the lawsuit. Once the papers were served, my parents would have to respond. I remember sitting there, listening to Patterson talk, and I couldn't help but think about the consequences. This wasn't just going to affect my parents. This was going to shake up everything. The family, the relationships, everything I'd grown up with. But I didn't care anymore. The trust fund was for my education, and they'd stolen it. They were going to pay for that. Do you want to settle if it comes to that? Patterson asked, looking me straight in the eyes. No, I said firmly. I want them in court. I want to thought they thought they could do this. Patterson smiled. All right, then. Let's go to war. And just like that, it was official. This was no longer just a personal issue between me and my parents. It was legal. It was business. And it was about to get a whole lot more complicated. The following week, the lawsuit was filed. I still remember the moment the papers were served. I wasn't there for it. I was at work, trying to keep my mind off the mess my family was about to get into. But Patterson later told me that the moment my dad at the door and saw the papers, his face went pale. It was only the beginning. But I had a feeling my parents didn't realize yet how deep they were about to sink. The lawsuit had been filed. The papers had been served. And now the waiting game began. But the calm before the storm didn't last long. I expected my parents to be upset, to try to talk things through with me, to maybe offer some kind of explanation. Instead, they went straight into damage control. The phone calls started coming in. My mom called first, her voice trembling, like she was scared I would say something that would ruin everything. "Stanley, we need to talk about this," she said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the panic in her voice. "This isn't the way to handle things. We're your parents. You can't do this to us." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The hurt in her voice wasn't enough to me back down. I wasn't about to listen to her plead, not after everything they'd done. Then my dad called. He was angry, his tone sharp and bitter. "You're destroying this family over money, Stanley," he said. "Do you really think this is the way you handle things? You've gone too far this time." I didn't even want to listen. It was the same thing they always said when they were cornered. "You're tearing the family apart." It was their go-to line, the one they used to guilt trip, and I stood up for myself. But this time, it wasn't working. The next few days were a blur of legal documents, phone calls from my lawyer, and increasingly frantic messages from my parents. They seemed to think that kept calling, kept asking me to reconsider, I'd somehow back off. But I wasn't going to let them manipulate me this time. I had a meeting scheduled with Patterson, my lawyer. He was handling everything now, and it was like Lee been lifted off my shoulders. As much as I wanted to confront my parents face to face, I knew better. This wasn't a family argument anymore, it was a legal battle. Everything had to be handled through my attorney. I sat down in Patterson's office, feeling a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in days. "What's next?" I asked him. He smiled, leaning back in his chair. "We start the discovery process. We're going to request all financial records, bank statements, and any communications related to the trust. I know your parents are going to fight it, but we'll get everything we need. And then we'll go after them in court." The way he said it made it feel inevitable, like there was no way they could avoid what was coming. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was what they'd done and making them face the consequences. Sure enough, the discovery phase kicked off. Patterson sent out requests for the necessary documents, everything from my parents' financial statements to any e-messages they had about the trust. My parents didn't take kindly to it. They hired a lawyer who wasn't quite up to the task. He was some general practitioner, probably a friend of my dad's, who had no experience with trust litigation. I knew he was in over his head from the first time I saw him in court. The back and forth with their lawyer was like a game of cat and mouse. They tried to push back, claiming that the discovery requests were too broad, but they were too invasive. But Patterson wasn't having it. He kept pushing, filing motions to compel the documents. It wasn't long before the judge ordered my parents to produce everything we'd asked for, or face sanctions. The pressure started to mount on them. The clock was ticking, and they were running out of time. Then came the bombshell. Patterson called me one afternoon with the news. "We've got them," he said, filled with satisfaction. The text messages: "Your sisters were talking about using your trust fund. Victoria asked your mom about accessing it for the wedding, and Ashley had messages about using the rear. It's all there. The proof we need." I didn't know how to react. I'd suspected it, but hearing the confirmation hit me like a freight train. My sisters knew. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't care. It wasn't just my parents who were complicit, they were too. The messages were clear. Victoria had asked my mom if she could use my trust fund for her wedding expenses. The exact amount was even discussed. Ashley had done the same for her down payment. It was all there in black and white. No more denials, no more I was finally getting what I needed, the proof. It felt surreal. Like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd been fighting for, was finally within reach. But that was just the beginning. Now that we had the evidence, it was time to move forward. Patterson was already preparing to file a motion for summary judgment. If the evidence was as solid as it seemed, my parents and sisters wouldn't stand a chance. The judge would see the breach of fiduciary duty, and the consequences would be unavoidable. The pressure was on, and I could feel it. My parents were battered, didn't matter. I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they'd done. I had the evidence, I had the law on my side, and soon, they would have to answer for their actions. This wasn't just about getting money. It was about justice. I was starting to realize, was a long time coming. The moment the papers were served, things started to move faster than I expected. My parents were in full damage control mode now, and I could see the cracks forming in their perfect little facade. They started scrambling, calling their lawyer, and having endless discussions behind closed doors. But no amount of pleading, no amount of guilt tripping, was going to make me back down. It wasn't long before I got another call from Patterson. The first round of depositions was scheduled, and it was time for my parents to take the stand. I'd been preparing myself for this moment, but when it finally hit, I was hit with a mix of emotions. There was anger, certainly, but also something else, a sense of calm. This was it. The moment when everything would come out into the open. They couldn't hide anymore. The day of the deposition, I sat in the back of the room as my parents faced Patterson across the table. My father was already trying to play the victim, acting like he was the one who'd been wronged. He kept talking about how hard it had been for him to make these tough decisions, how he'd done what he thought was best for the family. But Patterson wasn't buying it. He dug in immediately, presenting the trust documents, the bank statements, the timeline of the withdrawals. It wasn't long before my dad's story started to unravel. He couldn't explain how using the money for weddings and condos was in line with the purpose of the trust. There was no way to justify it. And that's when Patterson dropped the bombshell. "Mr. Thompson," Patterson said, his voice steady and sharp, "can you explain why the trust terms explicitly state that the money was to be used for education? It was spent on weddings and real estate." There was a long pause. My dad's face flushed with frustration, and I could see his mind racing, trying to come up with an answer that wouldn't make him look worse. He stammered, "We didn't think it would matter. Family is important. Weddings are important. We thought that using some of the trust money for those things was. Well, it seemed reasonable at the time." Patterson shot him down immediately. "Did you read the trust agreement? Did you understand that it explicitly forbids using the funds for anything other than education?" My dad didn't answer. He was trapped, and even though trying to keep his composure, I could see the cracks forming. He knew he had nothing left to say. Then it was my mom's turn. I watched her take the stand, her hands trembling, her eyes welling up with fake tears. It wasn't hard to tell that she was trying to play the role of the remorseful mother, but it wasn't working. "Mrs. Thompson," Patterson said, his voice cutting through her dramatics, "did you or your husband ever explain to your son what you were doing with his trust fund?" My mom blinked rapidly, as if fighting back the tears. "No. We didn't think he'd understand. We thought it was for the best. We never meant to hurt him. He'll understand when he's older." That was it. Hearing her say that, hearing her imply that I wouldn't understand the gravity of what they'd done, it was the final straw. But I had to hold it together. I couldn't let my anger show, not in front of the lawyers. Patterson pressed her again. "But did you ever consider the legal consequences? Did you understand that you were breaking the terms of the trust? That you were stealing from your own son's future?" She looked down, avoiding his gaze. There was no real answer. She couldn't deny what they'd done, not with the proof Patterson had laid out in front of her. After their depositions, it was my turn. I wasn't nervous. I needed every document, every piece of evidence. I was going to take control of this, no more running from it. When I took the stand, I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I just told the truth. I explained how I'd apply for life around that trust fund. How it was supposed to help me get a degree, build a future, and not have to rely on anyone for support. I talked about the sacrifices I'd made, the hard work I'd put in to save up my own money, just to see it all wiped out for their selfish indulgence. And then I said it, the words that had been burning in me ever since I found out. They didn't just take my money, they took my future. And they thought they'd get away with it. I could see the impact of my words. My parents' lawyer tried to discredit me, tried to paint me as the vengeful son, the one doing this out of spite. But I didn't let him. I stayed focused, stayed on track. This wasn't about revenge, it was about holding them accountable for what they'd done. I saw them react, my mom's face twisted in a mix of guilt and frustration. They looked defeated. They knew they'd lost, but they didn't want to admit it. The fact was, they had no defense. The law was on my side, and they couldn't talk their way out of it anymore. The depositions were over, and now, Patterson was confident. He said we had a strong case, and I could feel it too. It wasn't just the money, it was the satisfaction of knowing that, for once, they couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. They were going to face the truth, no matter how badly they wanted to ignore it. The trial wasn't far off now. We were heading straight for the finish line, and nothing was going to stop me from getting the justice I deserved. It was finally time. The trial date, the court date, was rapidly approaching. I had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, building my case, and getting my emotions under control. The real battle was about to begin. When I walked into the courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. This was it, the culmination of everything I had worked for, everything I had endured. This was my chance to finally hold my parents accountable for what they had done, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in my way. The courtroom was far less intimidating than I had imagined. It was a sterile, formal place, filled with rows of empty seats, the air thick with the documents, and quiet conversation. Patterson and I sat at the plaintiff's table, and across from us sat my parents and their lawyer, looking more anxious than I had ever seen them. My mom was fidgeting with her hands, her eyes darting around the room, while my dad sat with his arms crossed, his face tight with tension. The judge entered, and the room grew quiet. Judge Harrison, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, took her seat at the bench. She wasted no time getting into the proceedings. The trial was scheduled for 3 days, but Patterson was confident we could wrap it up in 2. The first day was all about the opening statements and presenting the evidence. Patterson started by laying out the facts in clear, concise terms. He showed the trust documents, the terms of the trust, and the clear breach of fiduciary duty by my parents. He presented the timeline of withdrawals from my trust fund, proving that my parents had knowingly used my money for weddings and condos instead of education, as the trust had explicitly stated. When it was my parents' lawyers' turn to present their defense, I could see they were already on shaky ground. The lawyer started rambling, trying to spin some kind of emotional justification for their actions. He talked about family and how difficult it was to make financial decisions in a time of crisis, but it was clear he was grasping at straws. Judge Harrison didn't seem impressed. She interrupted him several times, asking pointed questions about the trust terms, and the lawyer was unable to provide any solid answers. It felt like the ready turning in our favor. But it wasn't until the second day that the real fireworks began. That was when my parents took the stand. I watched my dad as he was sworn in. He seemed smaller, almost like he was shrinking under the weight of what was happening. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so in control of everything, now appeared vulnerable. Patterson started asking him about the withdrawals from my trust fund, and whether he knew he was violating the terms. My dad tried to justify himself, claiming that the weddings were important family milestones, and that he thought using the money for those events was interest of the family. But Patterson wasn't buying it. He asked my dad point blank, "Did you think it was okay to use Stanley's trust fund for something other than his education?" My dad hesitated for a moment. I thought it was for the best. Family comes first. Judge Harrison, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, your son's future was supposed to come first. Not weddings, not condos. The trust was set up with a clear purpose. The question is, did you understand that?" My dad faltered. He didn't have a good answer. He couldn't. Next, it was my mom's turn. She took the stand, her voice shaky as she tried to explain herself. She started with the usual, how hard everything had been, how they were just trying to do what they thought was best. But this time, it was different. The truth was coming out. Patterson asked her, "Did you understand the terms of the trust? Did you understand that you were violating those terms when you used the funds for weddings?" My mom's eyes filled with tears, but it wasn't genuine. I could see it now. She was trying to play the part of the remorseful mother, but I wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what she had done. She knew exactly what she was a part of. She answered, "I didn't think it would matter. I thought Stanley wouldn't mind." The words hit me like a slap in the face. I thought Stanley wouldn't mind. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't just the money, it was the complete disregard for me, for my future. To her, I was just an afterthought. She didn't let up. Did you ever consider that Stanley might mind? Did you ever think about how he might feel about you spending his future on weddings? Her face flushed, and she couldn't respond. That was when I realized something. This wasn't just a financial crime. It was a moral one. They had stolen my future, and they didn't even care. They thought they could get away with it. And now, the whole world would know. The deposition of my sister was next. They both invoked the Fifth Amendment, refusing to testify. Their lawyer advised them to stay silent, and they took his advice. It was a smart move legally, but it looked terrible in court. Judge Harrison raised and read and noted it for the record, making it clear she wasn't impressed. By the end of the second day, I knew we were winning. My parents were unraveling under the pressure. Their excuses sounded weaker and weaker, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. The trust had been misused, and they had no good reason for it. The third day was the closing arguments. Patterson summed it all up perfectly. The defense their fiduciary duty. They knowingly misused the trust fund for purposes that were never intended, and now their son is left with nothing but the consequences of their actions. When my turn came to speak, I kept it short. They took my future. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it. But I'm asking for what's mine now, and I won't stop until I get it. Judge Harrison listened carefully, then adjourned the court for day. We had to wait for her decision, but I knew it was only a matter of time. And when the decision came, I was ready. The fight wasn't over yet, but I was closer than ever to getting what I deserved. The days leading up to the ruling an eternity. I kept myself busy working, going to school, keeping my mind off the mess my family had created. But I couldn't completely escape it. The calls kept coming, the messages flooded my phone. My parents tried one last attempt at reconciliation, sending long emails full of guilt and regret, begging me to drop the lawsuit, claiming that this was tearing the family apart. But I didn't even open most of them. I had made my decision. There was no going back. I wasn't going to let them steal my future and get away with it. Not now, not ever. Then, one afternoon, the phone call came. Patterson's voice was calm, but I could hear the excitement in his tone. "We won, Stanley." "Full judgment. You're getting everything you asked for." My heart skipped a beat. He continued, "The court ruled in your favor. You're awarded $104,000 in damages, plus punitive damages. Your parents and sisters are jointly liable for $98,000 of that judgment." I sat there, speechless. It wasn't about the money. It was victory. It was about the sense of justice, of finally being heard. They had taken from me, and now they were going to pay. Patterson went on, "Your parents are liable for the full amount, plus the punitive damages. They're going to have to sell their house to pay the judgment. The court also ruled that your sisters are liable for their share, but they'll likely have to liquidate assets to cover it." I couldn't help but feel a wave of satisfaction wash over me. This wasn't about punishing them, at least not in the way they thought. This was about making them realize the consequences of their actions. They thought they could just take everything from me without any repercussions, but now they were facing the music. I remember the moment the judgment was delivered. My parents didn't take it well. They immediately filed for bankruptcy, Chapter 13, which meant they had to create a repayment plan. The bankruptcy trustee would take over their assets, selling what needed to be sold and distributing the proceeds to creditors. The house went up for sale within a month. They had bought it for $320,000, but it sold for $385,000, thanks to a hot real estate market. After paying off the mortgage, they were left with barely enough to cover the judgment. It wasn't just the house that was affected. Dad's luxury car was where he couldn't make the payments. Mom's leased SUV went back to the dealer. They were now driving a used Honda Civic, one older than I was. I didn't feel bad for them. Not after everything they had done. Meanwhile, my sisters were scrambling. Victoria, who had always been the golden child, tried to claim she couldn't afford to pay her share, citing undue hardship. But the judge wasn't having it. She had assets, including a condo that could be sold, and the judge made it clear that she would have to pay her share. Ashley, on the other hand, tried to argue that she hadn't known the money came from my trust fund, but again, the evidence was clear. The text messages were undeniable. She knew. She had cooperated with the theft, and the court ruled against her as well. As they fought the judgment, I kept my distance. I didn't want to engage with them directly anymore. What they had stolen from me, and now they were paying the price. It didn't end there. The fallout from the lawsuit reached further than I had anticipated. Victoria's marriage fell apart. Her husband Jake, who had always seemed like the perfect match, filed for divorce. The debt, the public humiliation, the realization that they had lied about their financial situation, it was too much for him to handle. Ashley's engagement also had been disaster. Her fiancé, Brett, had been planning an extravagant wedding, but when he found out about her debt from the lawsuit, he called off the engagement. He couldn't marry someone who had that kind of financial baggage. I wasn't happy about their relationships falling apart, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt knowing that the consequences of their actions had finally caught to them. They had ruined my life, but in the end, they were the ones who had to deal with the fallout. By the time everything was finalized, I was focused on rebuilding my life. I had paid off my judgment, and I used the remaining money to invest in my future. I enrolled in a 2-year mechanical engineering technology program, working part-time to pay for it. I lived in a small rented room, but it was mine. It ain't anymore. It wasn't easy. The work was grueling. The classes were tough. But for the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my life. I wasn't living in the shadow of my family's mistakes. I was forging my own path. The money from the judgment wasn't what defined my success. It was the fact that I had stood up for myself. I had taken action when they thought I would, and accept what they had done to me. And now, I was moving forward with a future that was mine to build, on my terms. Months passed. My parents tried to reach out once or twice, but I didn't need to. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I heard through my Aunt Janet that my parents had been spending holidays alone, that no one wanted to be around them. My sisters had distanced themselves as well, caught up in their own mess. I didn't feel bad for them. My aunt invited me to Thanksgiving that year. She told me she'd understand if I didn't want to come, but I did. I spent the day with her family, people who didn't try to take from me, people who saw me for who I was, not for what they could get. The last time I spoke to parents, it was through an email from my dad. It was long, filled with anger, accusing me of destroying the family. He said he hoped I was happy with what I had done. I responded with one sentence. You chose money over our relationship when you stole my trust fund. I just chose to get it back. I blocked their emails after that. Life moved on. I finished my degree. I got a job as an engineering technician at a manufacturing company. I started dating who I met through a hiking group. Slowly, I learned to trust again. My parents' lives were in ruins. My sisters had to deal with the fallout of their choices, and me, I had built a future for myself. The trust fund was to give me a head start. But instead it became the catalyst for a series of events that led to me taking control of my life. I don't regret it, not one bit.